tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
And again, we're going around the world here. We're covering everything. We're covering education. We're covering Indigenous issues. We're talking about Jagmeet Singh. We're doing it all. But we have to cap things off with a look at one of the most profound examples of virtue signaling by the state, of putting this lofty ideological goal ahead of anything resembling science or facts or evidence. And that is the commitment to what is increasingly becoming a very dangerous net zero goal. Now, this is not being a quote-unquote climate denier. It's certainly not for being anti-science. It's about looking at the facts. We have had a couple of major international agreements that have dealt with fossil fuel use and emissions. We had Kyoto back in 1997. We had the Paris Accord back in 2015. Since both of those, we've seen fossil fuel consumption go up. We've seen emissions go up. The entry into a carbon tax by Canada that has continued to increase has not stopped emissions from increasing. And we're wondering, if you've been naive and just expected the government knew what it was doing, you've probably been wondering why. Well, the reality is that this is just not working. And what we have from our friend Kenneth Green, who has written a piece in the Toronto Sun about this, is a call on the government to abandon what is increasingly an unfeasible and damaging net zero plan. This has not worked. It's requiring a massive phase out of fossil fuels without an alternative. And that is the so critical part of this. Dr. Kenneth Green joins us once again. Always good to see you, Ken. Thanks for coming on today.
Always good to be with you, Andrew.
So this number has just become so arbitrary. We have to reduce by 2050. They'll occasionally say 2040. We have to go net zero here. We've got to reduce emissions by this amount. And none of it really matters in a way, because they're not doing any of it. We're not seeing any record here. But the policy mechanisms that are supposed to get us there are causing some real harms, are they not?
Yes, they are. And another one of the arbitrary targets we have is the 1.5 degrees C, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, which actually drives all of the other ones beneath it. The regulations on the energy sector are actually causing significant economic harm in Canada and also in the United States and around the world, because energy is intrinsic to producing economic growth and economic productivity, and it's economic productivity and growth that lead to prosperous and thriving societies. And so these regulations, which are increasing the costs of energy to manufacturers, to producers, to consumers, to homeowners, are all basically causing economic suppression and therefore lowering people's quality of life. In some cases, the regulations themselves are also causing leading to environmental harm separate from climate change, for example. So with plastics regulations, that Canada has a goal of phasing out, of reaching zero plastic waste by 2030. The studies show that the substitutes people are using for plastics are actually causing more harm to the environment. They generate more amounts of waste that have to be managed, and they pose health risks to people different than plastics do. So the regulatory, the crusade for, or jihad for net zero 2050 is leaving a considerable amount of damage in its wake.
And the one thing that I find so fascinating about this is that no one is talking about energy. I shouldn't say no one, you are, but no one in the government is talking about energy demands. We have a lot of very ambitious goals, even if we go all in on electric vehicles, and this will require energy. And I've yet to see anyone even so much as have a discussion about where that's going to come from. Even when people talk about renewables, it's all very theoretical. They have not actually provided a roadmap of matching energy needs, which will only increase, but even at the current level, with alternative energy.
Well, energy needs are huge, not only in Canada and the United States, but around the world, and especially in developing countries that are still using wood and dung for cooking fires and things. And so the global energy demand is massive, and it will only expand with population, with global population. But the question you ask is a really valid one, which is, how are we going to match the demand with supply? And this is an area where governments, I believe, especially what governments who are in the Western governments and those who are in the net zero school of thought and the climate, are concerned about, basically have climate change as their center of their existence. This is where I believe they're actually mostly insincere, because they actually don't intend to supply the demand. They
So
promise, but they don't intend to deliver. And historically, that's what has happened, which is they promise you an alternative or a better version. We don't. It's not that we don't want you to have energy. We want you to generate it with this way, wind or solar, instead of fossil fuels. It's not that we don't want you to have your refrigerator. We want you to have this super hyper efficient refrigerator. It's not that we don't want you to have a barbecue, but it has to be an electric barbecue. But the thing is, they just never, when the time comes for them to give you that alternative, the electric car that matches your vehicle, you don't get it. They don't give it to you, and the prices never come down to match the pre-existing competitive sources. So these things just don't manifest. And I think that's actually a goal, which is they want to actually reduce humans' access to energy because they want to control people more rigidly and have them do less things. They don't want you flying around in airplanes. That's not for the commoners. That's for the elites. They don't want you living in sprawling bigger houses or independent houses or even individual houses. They want to constrain people's behavior and constrict humanity because of that is their philosophy, is that human activity is detrimental to the world, is killing the world.
The other thing you have to look at as well is, I think, the moving goalposts on this. And the goalposts have not just moved on the target and on when, but even whenever the UN COP summits on this come up, you'll always have these radical groups that will say, no, net zero isn't good. We need absolute zero. So they're actually against things that industry can do to mitigate emissions. They're against things like carbon capture. They're against carbon, all of these alternatives. And when you hear people talk about absolute zero, and again, it's not just fringe people, it's some legitimate people, they actually are anti-industry. I mean, they're anti-human. They want us to all just be sitting in dark rooms alone, and that is the goal. And that's why whenever you hear, occasional proposals from some city council in, Quebec, say, to ban wood stoves, I mean, that's actually quite revealing about the state of contempt they have for Western 21st century life.
It's not even Western 21st century life. It's the life since the humans harnessed fire and learned how to cook their food. Humans need energy and use energy to transform things into the substances that keep them alive, materials and things that keep them alive. And so, the goalposts shift constantly. That's something that, of course, is well known, and of course all the subsidiary goals shift as well, which is, no, it's not enough for the West to give the developing countries $1 billion a year. Now they have to give them $1 trillion a year. Now they have to give them $2 trillion a year in order to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It is a never-ending shifting goalpost, and it has been since Kyoto in 1997. But again, of course, we're seeing some of that here at home as well, which is, back over the last 20 years, it was you have to phase out coal. We want you to phase out coal, and you can use natural gas. And now the new call is no natural gas either, just wind and solar. And when the wind and solar, if that would ever happen, it was all wind and solar, then they would no doubt find a way to say, well, yeah, but no wind, because windmills are killing birds, and it is a ratchet to zero. It's a ratchet to extremism, and it is in fact a rejection of the idea of human nature as being an empowered species, humanity as being an empowered species that can change the world by the use of energy and materials. It's a fundamental rejection of the acceptability of having human beings on your planet.
Now, I'm from Ontario, so obviously my experience is different than it is for other people, because we have an Ontario hydroelectric. We also have nuclear, but nuclear is probably the greatest way to expose the utter hypocrisy from a lot of the emissions hawks, because these people that want low emission energy sources, you bring up nuclear, and all of a sudden, no, not like that.
Absolutely, that's what I say is you can recognize their actual goals by what they do, which is the rejection of nuclear power, which was known, of course, as a very low greenhouse gas emitting activity, and it has been safely used for 60 years, or actually 80 years, maybe. The rejection of nuclear power, absolute rejection and continued rejection of it, does show their complete and utter insincerity about the reality of what they want to achieve. They don't want to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions at the least cost while still maintaining humanity's energy profile. And they have rejected that every single time in favor of socialist measures that control and redistribute wealth. That's the other thing, which is you don't get to reward too many cronies if you're really relying on nuclear power, and you don't get to play the subsidy game very much because nuclear power doesn't require a lot of subsidies.
Yeah, and I mean, it's low cost as well. It's not it's accessible. I mean, obviously there's a significant upstart cost, but yeah. And the one thing I guess I'll say on this is that when you see electricity shortages in Alberta, when you see other things like this, it forces people to realize that some of these discussions are a bit of a luxury item, and that when people are living through some minus 40-degree winter, it forces them to realize that, okay, maybe I don't want to just shut things down entirely. So I do think that for the non-activist, there is a bit of a realization coming that some of these things are just infeasible.
I think that's true. That's true. I think for the non-activists, for the non-committed believers, I think people are looking at the effects of the climate policies on their wallet, on their house, on their wallet, on their safety, in their cars and in their houses, and against the climate, basically safety from fires, safety from storms, and they're seeing that these climate policies are not desirable and not giving them anything of benefit. They're not giving them a benefit, but they're certainly imposing a cost that people are increasingly seeing taking a bite out of their paycheck every month. And I think there's a loss of appetite for these extreme plans, not only in Canada but also around the world, where some governments that are shifting right are vowing to move away from net zero at 2050, much less not go to absolute zero. No one is ever going to absolute zero carbon emissions because it's impossible. But I think there is a waning of enthusiasm for this. In polls, climate change doesn't come up very highly compared to other people's other needs for what they think is important, such as affordable housing, good education, healthcare. I think climate has never polled very well amongst the normal people who are not activists, which is, I think, why we have actually seen the activists held down in terms of their ambition, the scope of their ambitions, for so many years, since 1997, to impose draconian regulations, draconian taxes, draconian limitations on energy use, bans on fossil fuels and things like that, because people are not buying the extreme rhetoric. They look out the window. That's the thing, right? As one of my former colleagues, or a former climatologist, used to say, don't look away from the weather report on your phone and look out the window. And does the world look like it's being destroyed? And so are you seeing the disasters that you're hearing about constantly? All of the wildfires, floods, and droughts. Is that happening near you? And people are looking at it going, I'm just not seeing it. The air is cleaner than it's ever been before. In Canada and the U.S. in terms of normal pollutants and conventional pollution. There's quality of life is good, safety is high. So, I think people are losing enthusiasm for these issues, and it's only a matter of time until that's reflected in the vote.
I always like when the delegate for the Maldives at the UN Climate Summit will say, we're going to be underwater any minute now. And then you look and realize that the Maldives has opened like 30 beachfront resorts in the last year. And you're saying, well, you're not behaving like a country that's drowning.
Yeah, they're actually growing in landmass. That's one of the things that was the funniest things of all about the climate change and the low-lying islands thing, is that it turns out when sea levels come up, the islands grow because they're actually partly live ecosystems. And so a lot of these islands that were supposed to be underwater by now have actually expanded in their land area. And the coral reefs, of course, are which were supposed to be dead 20 years ago and dead and extinct 20 years ago, are just exploding with vigor. So Australia, which was saying, we're going to lose our economy because we're going to lose our coral reefs. It's not happening, and they're not behaving as if they think it's going to happen.
Yeah. Oh, it's the same. You get the fear-mongering about polar bears in the north when their population's thriving. So, well, it's a great piece in the Toronto Sun. Dr. Kenneth Green, Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. Always a pleasure, sir. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Andrew. You too. Take care.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.